At 2:48 in the morning, the North Atlantic was nothing but darkness and cold breath rolling across the waves. Then, through a British officer's binoculars, a shadow emerged, enormous, silent, impossibly fast. A steel wall cutting the ocean open as if the sea itself were fleeing from it. In that instant, every alarm in the Royal Navy seemed to ring at once. The Bismarck had arrived. And within minutes, the most feared battleship on Earth would unleash a catastrophe no one in Britain could ever forget. When the Bismarck slipped into the water in 1939, it wasn't presented as just another battleship. It was introduced as a warning, a steeled proclamation that Germany intended to dominate the Atlantic once and for all. At full displacement, it outweighed anything the Royal Navy could put to sea. Its 15-inch guns could tear open a cruiser with a single hit. Its armor belt was thick enough to shatter most incoming shells. Even its engines were a message. They could push this monster across the North Atlantic faster than almost anything Britain had. But the true danger wasn't the ship's guns or its armor. It was its mission. German high command believed a single breakthrough into the Atlantic could choke Britain's supply lines. Fuel, food, ammunition. Everything Britain needed to survive crossed the ocean in convoys protected by thin screens of escorts. If the Bismarck reached those lanes, it could sink dozens of ships before the Royal Navy could react. British intelligence had warned for months that a breakout was coming, but no one knew when. No one knew where. So when the Bismarck finally raised anchor in May 1941 and headed north toward the Denmark Strait, Britain understood one thing with perfect clarity. It had begun. To the outside world, the Bismarck seemed less like a ship and more like a prophecy. Newspapers called it the steel titan of Europe. German broadcasts described it as the pride of a reborn navy, a vessel so advanced that no Allied guns could touch it. Even within the Kriegsmarine, sailors whispered about the ship as if it were untouchable, a floating fortress crafted to shrug off anything the British could throw at it. Photographs reinforced the illusion. Officers laughing on deck. Clean corridors gleaming under fresh paint. A shipyard masterpiece built with the precision of a nation obsessed with engineering perfection. It had its own bakery, medical facilities, climate-controlled rooms, comforts unheard of on most warships. To many, this wasn't just a battleship. It was the symbol of Germany's new naval ambition, the weapon that would rewrite maritime power. Hollywood-style myths formed instantly that the Bismarck was too fast to be caught, too heavily armored to be sunk, and too powerful to be challenged. But inside the Admiralty in London, no one believed the legend. Britain knew something the world didn't. No matter how magnificent the ship looked, no warship escapes the ocean alone. And the Bismarck was heading there, alone. Behind the gleaming steel and the triumphant speeches, the Bismarck carried a truth so dangerous that only a handful of officers dared speak it aloud. The ship was powerful, but it was isolated. Germany didn't have a fleet, it had a collection of singular giants. The Royal Navy didn't fear the Bismarck because it was strong. They feared it because they knew what would happen once the chase began, one ship against an empire. Captain Ernst Lindemann understood this better than anyone. He wasn't blinded by propaganda or impressed by the ship's luxury. He had commanded vessels long enough to know that a battleship alone is not a weapon, it's a target. Quietly, almost reluctantly, he told his officers, "We will return as heroes, or not at all." And then came the flaw the world couldn't see in photographs, the Bismarck's vulnerability to internal damage. During its clash with HMS Prince of Wales, a single British shell slipped through the armor and ruptured a fuel tank. It didn't destroy the ship, it exposed it. Oil poured into the sea behind the Bismarck, creating a long, shining scar across the Atlantic. To the sailors on the deck, it looked like a minor technical issue. To British reconnaissance pilots, it was a lighthouse. The Bismarck was supposed to strike like a ghost. Instead, it was now bleeding across the ocean, marking its path with every mile. The world believed the Bismarck was untraceable. But the truth was clear: a monster that leaves a trail cannot hide for long. When the Bismarck finally met the Royal Navy in open waters, it wasn't a duel of equals. It was a collision between a rising monster and a fading legend. For 2 decades, HMS Hood had been Britain's proudest warship, the mighty Hood, the ship schoolchildren memorized, the vessel newspapers used as proof of British naval supremacy. But admirals knew something the public didn't: the Hood carried a fatal flaw. Its deck armor, designed in another era, was too thin to resist modern plunging fire. It was a giant, but a giant built for the last war. At dawn on May 24th, the Hood and the brand-new battleship Prince of Wales sighted the Bismarck in the Denmark Strait. The British opened fire first. Great plumes of water erupted around the German ships, close, but not close enough. Then the Bismarck answered. And its answer rewrote naval history. The third German salvo arced high, then fell at the perfect angle, straight onto the Hood's weak deck. One shell tore through the armor, plunged deep, and detonated in the aft magazine. For 1 second, there was silence. Then the ocean exploded. A column of flame hundreds of feet high burst from the ship's core. The Hood split open, broke apart, and vanished beneath the waves in less than 3 minutes. Out of 1,418 men, only 3 survived. The Bismarck had won its first battle in just 6 minutes. And with that victory, its doom began. The moment the Hood vanished beneath the waves, the Royal Navy changed. The shock was immediate. The humiliation was personal. And every ship that could burn coal or oil received the same order: find the Bismarck. Do not let it escape. What followed was the largest naval chase ever mounted. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, all fanned out across the North Atlantic in a tightening noose. The sea became a battlefield without gunfire, a silent hunt where every hour mattered. But the Bismarck still had one weapon Britain couldn't counter: speed. Pushing over 30 knots, it surged southward, aiming for the safety of Brest, where Luftwaffe fighters could shield it from attack. If it reached France, the hunt was over. And Britain knew it. But the Bismarck had another advantage: cunning. On the night of May 24th, it suddenly turned toward its pursuers. British cruisers panicked, scattering to avoid imagined gunfire. In the confusion, the Bismarck slipped into a heavy fog bank and vanished as if the ocean had swallowed it whole. For 31 hours, not a single Allied ship knew where it was. Convoys were exposed. Admirals argued. Churchill demanded hourly updates. A single battleship was holding the Allies hostage. Then came the mistake. Admiral Lucien sent a long radio message to Berlin, too long. British direction finding triangulated the signal. The Bismarck was heading for France. And only one British unit stood in its path: the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. Its planes were Swordfish, slow, fragile biplanes wrapped in fabric and hope. They looked ridiculous against the most advanced battleship on Earth. But the Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns had a flaw: they were calibrated for fast targets. The Swordfish flew too slowly to hit. They approached in terrible weather. Flak burst around them, but they kept coming. 14 torpedoes missed. The 15th torpedo did not. It struck the stern and jammed the rudder hard to port. In an instant, the Bismarck could no longer steer. The monster was crippled, circling helplessly in the Atlantic, waiting for the hammer to fall. Through the night, the crippled Bismarck drifted in wide, helpless circles. Waves slammed against its twisted hull. British destroyers stalked around it like wolves, firing intermittent torpedoes, not to sink it, but to keep the exhausted German crew awake, alert, and terrified. There was no rest. No repairs. No escape. At dawn on May 27th, the sky turned the color of steel. And on that horizon came the final blow. 2 British battleships, Rodney and King George V, advanced in silence, their guns already trained on the wounded giant. These were not hunting ships anymore. They were executioners. At 8:47 a.m., the order was given. A thunderclap rolled across the Atlantic as the first British salvo roared through the air. Shells the size of small cars slammed into the Bismarck superstructure. Fire control systems evaporated under the impact. Rangefinders shattered. The bridge disappeared in a cloud of flame and steel. Still, the Bismarck tried to fight back. Its main turret strained, turning slowly, blindly. The first German shots flew wide, not from fear, but because the ship's brains had been shot away. Without firing solutions, its guns were little more than monuments. The British kept firing. Close. Relentless. Unforgiving. By 9:20 a.m., the Bismarck was unrecognizable, a burning, twisted carcass drifting on the waves. Turrets A and B were destroyed. Turret C jammed. The deck was a maze of flame and torn metal. Hundreds lay dead or dying inside the ruins. And yet, the ship wouldn't sink. Its armored belt, designed to resist anything afloat, held firm even as the world above it collapsed. No matter how much punishment the British delivered, the Bismarck stubbornly stayed on the surface, as if refusing to give its killers the satisfaction. The final act came from within. Knowing the ship would be captured or humiliated, the German crew opened the sea valves. Water rushed in. The Bismarck slowly rolled to port, hesitated, then slipped beneath the waves at 10:39 a.m. Of 2,200 men, only 114 were pulled from the freezing water. The legend was gone, and the era of battleships died with it. When Robert Ballard found the Bismarck in 1989, lying 3 miles down on the ocean floor, he discovered something chilling. The ship was still intact. Its hull stood upright, its guns elevated as if still aiming at an enemy long vanished. Even in death, the Bismarck looked ready for war. But the silence surrounding it told the real story. Not of victory, but of isolation. A superweapon forged for dominance, undone not by inferior firepower, but by the weight of an entire navy. For all its steel, precision, and engineering brilliance, the Bismarck was a relic of an era that ended the moment it sank the Hood. Its triumph sealed its fate. Its power became its curse. Its legend became its death sentence. And as the cold Atlantic slowly swallowed the last air trapped within its shattered hull, it proved a truth older than any navy: no matter how mighty a warship is, the ocean does not forgive those who sail alone. The Bismarck ruled the Atlantic for 8 days. Then it was gone, taking 2,000 men and the battleship era with it.